My name is James O'Hara, and I am a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society. I am also a retired professor at Loyola University, Maryland, which is located in Baltimore. My interest for many, many years has been the Supreme Court's history and the lives of the justices who have served. This library that we're in is a collection of books about and by Supreme Court justices. It contains almost all of the biographies ever written of anyone who ever served on the Supreme Court. From George Washington's day until the present, there have been 112 justices. And in this room, if you start at the top shelf behind me, we will have the biographies and other materials relating to the justices appointed by George Washington. The collection together is probably the most valuable collection of books on the people who have served on the Supreme Court that there is in existence. If you look at the shelves, some of the shelves are actually at present empty. And the reason is that because of the grant that we've already received from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we've started that digitization. I've always loved visiting secondhand bookstores. I started to pick up biographies of Supreme Court justices, and I read them. And after a while, I had a very large collection. And when the Supreme Court Historical Society moved from its very cramped quarters on 2nd Street, right behind the Supreme Court, to this building on East Capitol Street, they had this room, and they had rooms upstairs with bookshelves and no books. So I decided at that point to contribute my books. The oldest book in this collection is a book published in 1804. It is a collection of the writings of Justice James Wilson. Justice Wilson was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he was appointed to the Supreme Court by President George Washington. He died in 1899, but he was very important in the history of American law, and only 5 years or 6 years after his death, this book, it's actually 3 volumes, I've only brought out volume 1, it's called Wilson's Essays, and it's his writings on various aspects of law, and it's not in the best of condition, but we haven't had the opportunity yet to have it fully restored. Mr. Justice Bushrod Washington, Supreme Court Justice on the Marshall Court. Not many people know that there was a justice of the Supreme Court named Washington, and not many people know that he was George Washington's nephew, and not many people know that when Martha Washington died, he inherited Mount Vernon, and he lived there. He is also buried at Mount Vernon in the same crypt, that hillside crypt where George and Martha Washington are buried, Bushrod Washington and his wife are buried. This is a doctoral dissertation from the 1970s done at the University of Notre Dame. There's one amusing book that's in the collection. When Justice Ginsburg's husband died, he was a gourmet cook. And the justice jokes about the fact that she said, in my house, I took care of the law and he took care of the kitchen. And when he died, a number of the spouses of Supreme Court justices were approached by Mrs. Alito and asked if perhaps it would not be possible to publish a collection of Mr. Ginsburg's recipes. And the Supreme Court Historical Society was asked by the spouses of the justices if we would publish it. We've never published a cookbook before, and we thought we might lose money on it. But in point of fact, it is the best-selling book we have ever published. And we actually have in this library a collection or a copy of that cookbook autographed by Justice Ginsburg. And I'm not even sure we ought to have it on the shelves. I think we ought to have it under lock and key, and maybe years from now put it on the shelf. It's pretty valuable when you have a Supreme Court justice autographing a cookbook that essentially was written by her husband. But there is a tremendous gap in the Supreme Court history in two areas or eras of the past. One is the period from roughly the death of John Marshall to the Civil War, and the second is roughly the period from President Ulysses Grant until 1900. Those two areas need a great deal of scholarly work. The digitization of this library will be of immense importance to that work. The real value of digitization, aside from the fact that the collection can be now available online across the country, the real value for people who work in this building is that they do not have to touch the books. Some of the books that I've shown you, a book from 1804, the more that book is handled, the more likely it is to deteriorate. And to the extent that it is possible that we can keep the books from being handled, to that extent this library can be preserved not only for people to use them in the present, but preserved for people who are going to use them 100 years from the day that we're sitting here now. There's one interesting thing as you begin to approach Supreme Court history. First, you note that there are some questions that the court has to address that involve either an interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, or they have to involve an interpretation of some law passed by Congress. There are new questions that come before the Supreme Court every year. Sometimes that new question may relate to, say, a copyright law change that was made last year. Or it may involve, to take an example that we're all familiar with, the Affordable Care Act, or as it's currently called, Obamacare. There were constitutional questions relating to that. And those are new questions. So the court sometimes has to grapple with a new question that no one thought of until 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 25 years ago. But there's another element that a Supreme Court historian will note, and that is there are some questions that are recurring questions. I can't even find the word to describe it. We were excited, exhilarated that the National Endowment for the Humanities became interested in this cause and have given us some money to assist with the digitization. So that's a little bit about the Supreme Court Historical Society's Library on the Justices.